To introduce our keynote speaker this evening, please welcome Matt Schlapp and ACU board member John Eddy.
I wanted to just say a couple of things about one of our newest board members, John Eddy. You can see John Eddy's name graces the stage here and around the front. But there's a name also that graces that stage, and that's Tracy Eddy, and we're really sorry that Tracy is not able to be with us tonight. I worked with Tracy in the White House, and she's a wonderful person, and we're very proud to have John on our board. I just wanted you all to know that John has stepped forward to help the conservative cause in so many ways. He was a founding chairman of this great group called American Majority, which helped lead our training, our activism boot camp on the Wednesday before CPAC, and we are so appreciative of all the things John has done to help ACU. And he is going to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you for everything, John.
Well, one thing I did notice when Matt was speaking today was to keep it short and you will do well. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Governor Mike Pence, our keynote speaker. As governor, he has balanced the budget. He has added 100,000 new private sector jobs, and he's taken unemployment from 8% down to 5.8% in the great state of Indiana. I wish we had more of him here in Washington, D.C., that's for sure. So it is my pleasure to introduce the 50th governor of the state of Indiana, Governor Mike Pence.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that warm introduction. Good evening to you all. It's an honor to be with you among such a large group of so many Americans, men and women who represent the bulwark of the leadership of the conservative movement in the United States of America. I appreciate that kind introduction, but the introduction I prefer is a little bit shorter. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. You know, there's an old saying, when you see a box turtle on a fence post, you know one thing for sure: he didn't get there on his own. That's certainly true of my life. And other than my faith, my family, my beloved wife who's with me here tonight, and my fellow Hoosiers, I rise tonight first and foremost to pay a debt of gratitude to all of you. I owe so much to CPAC, to this movement, to the namesake of this dinner, for the inspiration and opportunities I have been given. It is good to be back at CPAC, the premier conservative gathering in the United States of America. We gather in 2015 in a challenging time in the life of this nation. An administration paralyzed by ideology and incompetence has weakened America's place in the world and stifled our nation's economy. While the challenges we face are daunting, the choices we must make to meet them are not. 50 years ago, Ronald Reagan helped to birth our movement with his iconic time for choosing speech. Today, I believe we are come to another time for choosing. You either choose to view America as a shining city on the hill that inspires the best in all mankind, or you don't. You either want America to stand by her friends and stand up to her enemies, or you don't. You either are for limiting the power of the federal government, or you're not. And you're either for protecting the unborn and the religious liberty of every American, or you aren't. Well, I say tonight, after winning both houses of Congress, more state houses than ever before, and electing 31 Republican governors in states like Maryland and Massachusetts and Illinois, the American people have made their choice, and we are on the verge of a great American comeback for our ideals. I believe that because I believe in this movement. My grandfather immigrated to this country from Ireland. My dad built a gas station business in a small town in southern Indiana. While I actually started in politics as a Democrat, when I heard the voice of the 40th President of the United States, it all changed for me. I lived the dream of becoming a congressman from that small town, and now I serve as governor of the great state of Indiana. You know, I served 12 years in the Congress, and I love to say, if I only had 12 years left to live, I'd want to live it as a member of Congress, because that was the longest 12 years of my life. The truth is, we haven't had a government as good as our people in Washington, D.C. for some time. But it's worse today than ever before. At home, the errors of this administration are almost too numerous to recount. Whether it's the government takeover of health care or now the internet, the president's unconstitutional executive amnesty, or the war on coal, this administration's policies are sapping our national vitality and threatening our prosperity. Now, most Americans understand you cannot improve health care by ordering every American to buy health insurance, whether they want it or need it or not. You cannot expect the internet to thrive beneath unwarranted and unjustifiable regulation. You cannot change the laws of this land by executive fiat. And you cannot build an energy policy by raising the cost of electricity on working Americans. It should almost go without saying, Obamacare must be repealed, the FCC's rule must be reversed, the President's executive action rescinded, and the EPA's war on American energy must end. But tonight, allow me to offer some advice to the rising generation of leaders who are gathered here at CPAC and maybe looking on from across the country, of how we might confront the challenges we face with renewed focus at home and abroad. First, let me submit that 2016 could actually be the first foreign policy national election since 1980. And sadly, this administration has reduced our Army to its smallest size since 1940. The Navy has fewer ships than at any time since 1916. And our Air Force has its smallest tactical fighter force in history. Now, history teaches that you cannot reduce our military strength without provoking our enemies. Weakness arouses evil. As we speak, ISIS is setting up franchises across the Middle East and is on the offensive across the Arab world. Now, the president says that jobs are the answer to violent jihad. Well, Mr. President, Jihadi John doesn't want a job. He wants to see paradise, and I think we should help him get there as quickly as possible. And with the growing threat of homegrown terror, it's important to remember that our first line of defense is the right of self-defense. Now more than ever, the right to keep and bear arms must not be infringed on the American people. But violent jihad is not our only threat. In Asia, China is massively expanding its military. Just last month, the Pentagon admitted that China's satellite and ballistic missile technologies are rapidly approaching parity with our own. And as we gather here tonight, a new iron curtain is descending down the spine of Europe as modern Russia seeks to redraw the map of Europe by force. Unlike the former Soviet Union that respected the strength of the West, Putin's Russia ignores talk of sanctions, claims land, and supports rebels in Ukraine with impunity. And if we didn't know enough about the threat we face from Iran, the Heritage Foundation's annual index of military strength, released just this week, lists Iran as, quote, by far the most significant security challenge facing the United States and its allies and its interests in the Middle East. Now, in a few days, the leader of our most cherished ally will come to Washington, D.C. to warn Congress and the American people of the gathering storm he believes will strike his country and threaten ours if we allow the world's most dangerous regime to obtain the world's most dangerous weapons. Traveling to Israel last December, I met with Prime Minister Netanyahu in his private quarters on the very day that the Palestinian Authority was trying to force a settlement on Israel through the United Nations that would have compromised Israel's security. I saw firsthand the resolve and determination of this courageous leader who stands too often alone in times of great peril across the Middle East. Speaker Boehner was right to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to address our Congress and our nation at such a time as this. Israel's cause is our cause. Israel's enemies are our enemies. If the world knows nothing else, let it know this: America stands with Israel. The truth is, you cannot command the respect of the world when you spend years apologizing to our enemies and abandoning our friends. Lecturing the American people about the Crusades while refusing to call Islamic extremism by name is an abdication of leadership. As President Reagan taught us, peace comes through strength. Providing for the common defense of the United States is the chief responsibility of our national government. With everything happening in the world, I believe, my fellow conservatives, I believe it is imperative that conservatives again embrace America's role as leader of the free world and the arsenal of democracy. I believe the time has come to dramatically increase defense spending to confront the knowable and unknowable threats of this still new century. Without rebuilding our military, no strategy or innovation, no matter how brilliant, will be sufficient to protect the American people and the sovereignty of the United States. Among other measures, we could revive the future combat systems of the Army and the Marine Corps, resume production of the best and most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, the F-22, and we could rebuild our Navy. A safer and more secure America is a stronger and more prosperous America. Of course, our strength begins at home, in our families, our communities, in our businesses, and in our states. So second, let me suggest that our movement also put the promise of federalism and state-based reform back at the center of the conservative agenda in the 21st century. As President Reagan said, it's important to be reminded, and I quote, that the federal government did not create the states created the federal government. Our states are not territorial outposts of the federal government. They are a wellspring of our vitality and reform. I should know. I come from a state that works. In Indiana, we've balanced budgets and have a AAA bond rating. That's a lot better than Washington, D.C. We passed the largest state tax cut in Indiana history. We have the largest educational voucher program in America. I'm proud to say Indiana was the first state to withdraw from Common Core. And amidst the shifting sands of contemporary culture and law, we have stood without apology for the sanctity of life, the importance of marriage, and the freedom of religion. And it's working. In our first 2 years in office, unemployment has dropped from over 8% to 5.8%. We've seen 100,000 new private sector jobs created, and last year we led the nation in manufacturing jobs created. Graduation rates are up, test scores are up, and life is winning in Indiana. Abortion is in decline in the great state of Indiana for the 5th straight year in a row. Now, I didn't come here to brag on Indiana. Well, I didn't just come here to brag about Indiana. I came really to encourage you encourage each of you here today with the progress that's being made in Indiana and in other Republican-led states, and to urge you as leaders and activists in this movement to take encouragement from the successful results conservative policies are achieving in states across this country. After 12 years in Congress and 2 years as governor, I am more convinced that the cure for what ails this country will come more from our nation's state capitals than it ever will from our nation's capital. So let's put state-based innovation and reform back at the center of our national agenda. Let's look to the example of Republican-led states that are balancing budgets and crafting solutions to the most intractable problems facing our nation. And that includes getting runaway federal spending under control. You know, when it comes to most public assistance programs, states are simply better equipped to innovate and manage anti-poverty programs in a fiscally responsible way. Because states can't print money. During my years in Congress, I honestly never recall anyone focusing on revenue forecasts when we passed a spending bill. But in Indiana, where we have balanced budgets, this year's budget will only be completed when we get the final revenue forecast to make sure that the income meets the outgo. And states are better equipped to innovate and reform those antiquated programs. In Indiana, we ended traditional Medicaid for all able-bodied adults and replaced it with consumer-driven health care and health savings accounts. We've expanded access to health care not through government mandates and taxes, but through market-based reforms grounded in personal responsibility and self-reliance. On education, because we believe that all honest work is honorable, today Indiana is crafting plans to be the first state in America to make career and vocational education a priority in every high school in our state again. So let's empower the states with renewed flexibility to develop positive, substantive alternatives. And let's give each other room as a movement to try new ideas and innovate without reflexively rejecting policies that break new ground. In fact, let's wean ourselves off the Washington-centered notion that every problem must find its answer in our nation's capital. Now, some say the next nominee of our party should be a governor, and I'm certainly sympathetic to that view. But all kidding aside, what I can tell you that I'm looking for is not somebody that says, send me to Washington, D.C., and I'll run our nation's capital the way I ran our state capital. For those of us who've served in this city, you know, Washington, D.C. is not a state, literally or figuratively. I'm listening for someone who says, send me to Washington, D.C., and I'll make it more possible for the next person running my state to run it with more freedom and more flexibility. That's the constitutional way. So when we win back the White House and re-elect Republican Congress, let's make it our aim to permanently reduce the size and scope of the federal government by restoring to the states the freedom, flexibility, and resources that is theirs under the Constitution of the United States of America. And finally, as we strive to be the party of solutions at home and abroad, let's be relentlessly positive. You know, I've said for years I'm a conservative, but I'm not in a bad mood about it. We need to be cheerful partisans, happy warriors. Lord knows we need a little optimism these days. I was reminded of that not long ago. I was at the Indiana State Fair, and a man walked up to me, a great conservative older gentleman with sad eyes and a weary look about him. He approached me to say that he supported everything I stood for, and then he asked with a trembling lip, he said, "Governor, do you think the country's going to make it?" He had all the telltale signs of excessive cable television viewing. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "Of course we're going to make it. We're Americans. We always make it. We always find a way." But you know, that man and millions like him are worried, understandably, about our country and our future because of the failings of our national government. Our national government does have all kinds of problems and flaws and weakness. But let's remember, America is not the American government. Let's stop confusing the American government with the American people. Ronald Reagan said it best: we are a people with a government, not the other way around. You know, I learned that lesson a long time ago, back when Indianapolis was hosting all the living recipients of the Medal of Honor. We were dedicating our memorial to all those great men throughout history. I was a talk radio show host at the time, and I had the privilege of interviewing those heroes, one of whom was a man named Jack Lucas. Jack was born in 1928 in North Carolina. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in August of 1942 at the age of 14. PFC Lucas was so determined to join combat that he stowed away on the USS Duel to join the 5th Marine Division as they went into the South Pacific. Jack turned 17 at sea just a few days before landing at Iwo Jima. On the day following the landing, Private Lucas was crawling through a ravine with 3 men in his rifle team when 2 enemy hand grenades landed nearby. The teenager used his own body to cover both hand grenades and saved his fellow Marines despite suffering horrible injuries. And in October of 1945, PFC Jack Lucas was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman. So I had him on my radio show, and during the interview, we talked about his experiences. We exchanged pleasantries. He spoke with remarkable humility about his extraordinary courage. And then I asked him a question. I said, Jack, you're part of the greatest generation. So you're probably really worried about this country when you see young people these days. Well, in that moment, Jack's countenance changed. And that old soldier looked at me and said, son, you obviously don't have the first idea what you're talking about. I laughed nervously. I mean, this was live radio. And I said, well, why don't you enlighten me? And he did. Jack said, let me tell you something. He said, growing up back in the 1930s, he said, we didn't have any more sense than kids do these days. He said, we wasted just as much time, we partied just as much, but when the time came, we stepped up because we're Americans, and kids these days will do just the same thing. Well, as we say, you know, I'd been told. I didn't know how right Jack was until a few years later, on a sunny morning in September of 2001. That day I found myself in my first term as a member of Congress on Capitol Hill. Sirens blaring in every direction, columns of mud-brown smoke billowing from the Pentagon. And the next day, there were lines outside every recruiting station in every city and town across this nation. And Jack was right. In the years that followed, in my trips downrange to visit our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, I saw the sacrifices of the new greatest generation, who, just like Jack said, stepped up and did what needed to be done. So I say with conviction tonight, the American people today, despite all the failings of our national government, the American people today are every bit as strong and patriotic and generous and selfless and resilient and freedom-loving as they have ever been throughout the great history of this great nation. And our nation deserves leaders of our party and this movement who believe in the American people with an unshakable faith. And faith is my final point, because we are not in this alone. The Bible says where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. When we hold the banner of liberty high, when we take up the cause of freedom at home and abroad, I believe with all of my heart we make His cause on this earth our very own, and we do not fight alone. So, my fellow conservatives, let's be confident and let's have faith. Faith in America's unique responsibility in the world and in the founder's vision of limited and constitutional government. Faith in the boundless capacity of the American people, especially in our states, to craft solutions to the complex problems that are facing us. And faith in Him who set this miracle of democracy on these wilderness shores, that He will fulfill His promise for this last best hope of earth. We have come to another time for choosing, and I believe with all my heart, with your help and with God's help, once again, America will choose freedom. Thank you, and God bless you.